And now, it's time for the Cannabis Reporter Radio Show with Snowden Bishop. Listen in as Snowden interviews cannabis industry pioneers, marijuana experts, policymakers, medical practitioners, patients, and other amazing individuals with compelling stories to share. It all happens right now. Here's the Cannabis Reporter, Snowden Bishop.
Evergreen is calling.
Hi, and welcome back to the Cannabis Reporter Radio Show. I'm Snowden Bishop. I'm happy you could join us. You know, it's hard to believe that it's been nearly 5 years since we launched the Cannabis Reporter online, and more than 3 years since we began recording this show. For us, this topic has become so normalized to the point where it's easy to forget that there's still a stigma associated with cannabis. It's even harder to imagine how it's still entirely inaccessible in more than a dozen states, even for medical use. It's also hard to believe that big banks are still arbitrarily closing accounts of sizable, legitimate, and legal cannabis businesses, despite the Safe Banking Act, which was the legislation that was passed last year in the House specifically to address the problem of interstate banking. Just the other day, a friend who owns an industrial hemp technology company told me that JP Morgan Chase just closed all of his corporate accounts, including all of his corporate credit cards, not more than a week after PayPal cut him off. This despite the fact that hemp has been legal to grow in the U.S. since the passage of the 2018 Farm Bill, and his company actually specializes in industrial hemp building materials. It would seem that these arbitrary actions are made out of an abundance of caution on behalf of the companies that are doing it, albeit entirely unnecessary. And when it comes to federally regulated banks, they're guided by federal laws, but most are unaware of the recent policy reforms. And the reason for that is just a simple lack of education. There's also still a stigma that bars people from really going out of their way to learn about it. But that's why we're here. Stigma exists in darkness, and cannabis is not a topic that gets a lot of airplay in mainstream media. That drives home the importance of outlets that do shed light on the topic, not just to educate bankers who are operating under arcane laws, but to normalize the topic so that people are interested enough to actually go and learn about it. Dr. Sanjay Gupta was actually among the first to delve into the topic of cannabis on his groundbreaking series called Weed, which began airing on CNN several years ago. The fact that he's a doctor and chief medical correspondent for the network enabled him to engage skeptical audiences far more effectively than, say, a cannabis culture enthusiast. It certainly generated a lot more widespread acceptance, and since it first aired, more than a dozen states have actually passed legalization measures. We've come a long way since then, but the more we learn about cannabis, the more we realize there's so much more to learn. That's why it's incumbent upon us in the media to continue to shine a spotlight on cannabis and keep the conversation going. That's the topic of today's show, and I'm really excited to introduce our guest, Louis Goldberg, who is doing just that as host of the Green Rush podcast. For more than 20 years, he's been a thought leader in public affairs, implementing programs designed to build businesses with a campaign mentality. He's worked in national, state, and local politics, including for former President Bill Clinton and then First Lady Hillary Clinton. As a managing partner at the East Coast PR firm KCSA, he founded the group's cannabis practice. And thanks to his weekly podcast, The Green Rush, he's become recognized as one of the most effective strategic thinkers in this growing industry. So, Louis, thank you. I'm so glad you're here, and I'm really looking forward to speaking with you.
Thank you for doing this. I appreciate you giving us the platform.
Oh, gosh, it's my pleasure. It really is. And I'm excited, actually, because it's rare for me to interview people who do what I do. And I have to tell you, I was interviewed on KTAR, which is probably one of the biggest talk stations here in Phoenix. and it was so strange to be on the other side of the microphone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found myself wanting to ask questions. I had to think about what I was doing, but yeah, so it's fun. And I love your show too. And some of the guests that you have on are pretty interesting. Also, I wanted to
Thank
mention
you.
that you celebrated your 100th episode this month, didn't you? Or last month?
We did. Yep.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. Congratulations on that. We had our 100th last year.
It's a big deal.
It is a big deal. It's like having a 50th birthday or something.
Oh, thanks, because that's coming up for me in April. So,
Happy birthday in advance. And yeah, so this is great. I wanted to pick your brain about the importance of this medium for educating people. And one of the things that I noticed is that oftentimes we are preaching to the choir a bit, because people who search for cannabis will find shows like ours. Green Rush is your platform, and you have a lot of corporate guests, and I imagine that it's more business driven than consumer driven. Would I be right about that?
Well, so we describe the show as the intersection of cannabis, the capital markets, and culture. So it tends to be more business driven. The thesis of the show was kind of like a college course where it's a 101. If you're interested in the business of cannabis, it's a really good way to get a primer on that. But if you know about the cannabis, it's a graduate level conversation. So it is designed to be accessible to anybody who wants to learn. And it is designed to give real deep insight into the issues that are being addressed in the industry and the people who are addressing those issues. And we really try to give those people the platform to reveal themselves as individuals. Because, if you're an investor, you don't only invest based on the balance sheet of a company. You're also buying a management team. And it's rare that these managers, CEOs, CFOs, and the like are given a platform to relax into a conversation. And that's what Ann and I really try to do, is give them that relaxed opportunity to be themselves.
Right. And Ann is your co-host. And I actually like the dynamic of having two people bouncing off ideas. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I like the fact that if someone's not in the cannabis industry, they could really glean a lot from listening to the show, because, cannabis is like any other sector. It's a business now. It's one of the fastest growing industries in our economy right now. And it's pretty exciting, even though it's still federally illegal. But I wanted to pick your brain, though, about the importance of getting this information out to eliminating the stigma that is still in the background associated with cannabis, and especially for people who are looking to come into this business as an investor or an entrepreneur. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, so the first thing is, cannabis is a huge industry as is right now, right? It's a $75 to $100 billion a year industry already. It's just the vast majority of it is illicit. So, what we are seeing is a conversion market take place. Like, we are converting, a market that is massive, and it's in all 50 states. But it's been unregulated, untaxed. And right now what we are in the process of doing, and I say we because even though I don't grow the product or sell the product or process it, I help tell those stories through my agency and also through my podcast. We're trying to explain all of the complexities around cannabis. If you look at the vaping crisis, for example, first of all, I hate to call it a crisis. It is a recognition that the illicit market is still an unbelievably vibrant, aggressive component to the overall industry. But the issue is, okay, so somebody wants to just outright ban, flavored vapes. Well, by the way, they've been banned for since 1970, when the Controlled Substances Act was passed, and that hasn't stopped people from consuming them. So if you're going to ban it in California or you're going to ban it in Colorado or Oregon, all you're going to do is give more power to the illicit market than already is there. And if you want to just regulate it, then how do you regulate it in a way that doesn't further disenfranchise people of color who have been over-indexed for targeting by law enforcement forever? It is such a complex issue, and giving people who are part of the solution the opportunity in a long-form conversation like this one to go into those complexities is really important. I think anybody who does a podcast, and I think podcasts are a great vehicle for this because they don't have to be 3-second sound bites. I work in a public relations firm. I'm one of the owners. I teach my clients to speak in 25-second sound bites because that's what works on TV. But in podcasts, I get frustrated when a guest gives me a sound bite. I want them to go into the depth of the detail of the issues that we're addressing, because that's where the real answers are. It's not in the manicured soundbite. It's in the nuance.
I couldn't agree more. And you mentioned a really good point. A lot of people have asked me, why do you do an hour-long podcast? And, one reason, of course, is that I have hour-long blocks on the network radio stations that air the show. So you have to kind of stick to that format. But online, so many people fear that doing anything more than a half an hour is going to lose a lot of the audiences that are accustomed to hearing those sound bites and getting their information in 3-minute videos in social media. And I think that having that opportunity to really go into depth with someone, it gets so many more nuances of a single issue that way. And, I really do appreciate that. So you're absolutely right. The other thing, too, is shedding light on an issue that was in the darkness for so long is really the only way to keep people from being afraid of it. And I wonder what your thoughts are about this, because there are a lot of people who are still opposed to the industry because they have a lack of information or because they've been conditioned to believe that it's bad somehow, or if they're a little bit older, they were raised in that devil's
The just say no era, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've all been I hate to use the word, but inoculated with the Nancy Reagan just say no, the reefer madness from the 30s, and it's it was intentionally done. Cannabis was called marijuana to demonize Mexicans. In the 30s, it was always cannabis before that. It was never marijuana, and language matters, and we, in any form of relating to the media, have a responsibility to be very careful with the words that we choose, so that we don't continue to perpetuate stereotypes. And a good example of that is calling the illicit market the black market, right? You wouldn't think that that's a big deal, but it is a big deal. It was intentionally called the black market because it targeted African Americans. It is the illicit market, the illegal market, the unregulated market. You call it the black market, you have an image of, somebody who is of color doing something illegal. We have to be really careful with the language that we use whenever we talk about any components of this industry, because it is so fraught. And I know that some people are going to think, he's a bleeding heart liberal or whatever. It's not that. It's I'm aware of the history of this industry and the like I keep saying, the nuance about it. And Richard Nixon was very, very devious and smart in the language that he used to attack this industry. And it has been perpetuated, from Ronald Reagan, even Bill Clinton, with his saying, "I never inhaled." that's a bunch of hooey. You know, he maybe never exhaled, but he definitely inhaled, or he ate edibles.
Well, and I think that there's just so much falsity out there. It's almost a farce,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, and people